The promise. The wind outside howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the old wooden windows of the small cottage. Inside, the air was heavy with the sharp smell of boiling herbs. Alina sat on a low stool beside her mother's bed, her thin hands carefully adjusting the wool blanket. Her mother's breathing was slow and shallow, each inhale sounding weaker than the one before. It was winter, and the cold seemed to crawl into every corner of the room, no matter how many layers of clothes they wore. A single candle burned on the bedside table, casting a soft, trembling glow across her mother's pale face. Her lips were dry, and her once bright eyes now looked dull, clouded by sickness. Alina's heart ached as she watched her mother struggle to swallow the warm tea she had made. Every cough made her flinch as if someone had struck her chest. She wished she could take the pain herself, wished she could trade places. But all she could do was sit and hold her mother's frail hand. The doctor had visited earlier that morning. His voice had been low and careful, as if speaking too loudly might break her. "She needs the surgery soon, Alina, within weeks. If we wait, she might not survive." The words had pierced through Alina's mind like a knife. Surgery cost money, far more than she had. She worked in the village market, selling vegetables, washing clothes for neighbors, even mending torn clothes at night. But no matter how hard she worked, she could never earn that much in time. When the doctor left, Alina had tried to smile at her mother, tried to hide the storm of fear inside her. "You'll get better soon, Mama," she said softly, stroking her mother's hair. But her voice had trembled, betraying her. That evening, the smell of rain drifted in from the outside as the clouds began to weep. A knock came at the door, slow and heavy. When Alina opened it, she found old Mrs. Harris, their neighbor. Her face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes were kind. "Child," Mrs. Harris said in a low voice, "I heard something, a strange thing. The wealthy landowner from the other side of the hills, Elias, is looking for a wife. They say he's crippled from an accident, can't walk anymore. He has no family, no children. He's willing to pay a large dowry to the woman who agrees to marry him." Alina blinked, unsure she had heard right. Marry a man she didn't know? A crippled stranger? It sounded like something from a sad story told to frightened children. Mrs. Harris continued, "They say he's not cruel, just quiet. But the money, Alina, it's enough to cover the surgery and more." The candlelight flickered on the wall, and for a moment, Alina felt as if the room had grown smaller, trapping her inside. She thought of her mother's labored breathing, the doctor's warning, the empty coin jar on the shelf. When she returned to her mother's bedside, the older woman was awake. Her eyes studied Alina's face as if reading her thoughts. "What's troubling you, my child?" her mother asked, her voice no louder than a whisper. Alina sat down and took her mother's hand. "Mama, there's a way to get the money for your surgery, but it means—" She hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. "It means marrying someone I've never met." Her mother's lips curved into a faint, pained smile. "Oh, my dear, you must live your life for you, not sell it for me." Tears filled Alina's eyes, blurring her vision. "Mama, I can't watch you suffer like this. I can't just sit here and do nothing. If I have to give up my own happiness to save you, I will." The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof like 1,000 desperate knocks. Her mother tried to protest, but Alina pressed a finger gently to her lips. "Don't say anything now. Just rest." Later that night, long after her mother had fallen asleep, Alina sat by the small window. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the world outside was silent except for the steady rhythm of the rain. Her thoughts swirled. Fear, doubt, and a strange kind of courage she had never felt before. She imagined walking into a strange house, standing before a man she didn't know, and saying vows that were supposed to bind two hearts. but she also imagined her mother, healthy again, walking in the sunlight, smiling the way she used to. Alina closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. I will save her, no matter the cost. The candle burned low, its wax dripping slowly down the side, just as the night slipped away. The choice was made. Tomorrow, she would send word to Elias. And somewhere deep inside, though she could not name it, Alina felt the quiet turning of fate, like the first stirrings of a storm far out at sea. The wedding without love. The day arrived faster than Alina expected. The winter sky was heavy and gray, like a sheet of dull steel hanging above the earth. Snow had fallen in the night, blanketing the small village in white, but the cold in her heart made the air outside feel almost warm in comparison. She dressed slowly that morning, her fingers trembling as she tied the faded ribbon at her waist. The dress was not new. It had been borrowed from her cousin Clara, who had worn it for her own wedding years ago. Tiny hand-sewn flowers ran along the hem, faded from time but still holding a quiet beauty. The veil was thin and slightly torn at one edge, but Alina did not mind. She told herself it didn't matter what she wore. This was not the kind of wedding little girls dreamed of. The small church sat at the top of a snow-dusted hill. Its old, wooden doors creaked as they opened, releasing a faint smell of candle wax and pine. The long aisle seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her. Villagers filled the benches, some whispering, some watching in silence. Alina could feel their eyes following her every step, eyes that carried curiosity, pity, and maybe a little judgment. And then she saw him. Elias. He sat near the altar in a dark, polished wheelchair, dressed in a fine black coat that seemed too formal for the humble church. His hair was dark with strands of silver, and his jaw was sharp, though his expression gave away nothing. His eyes met hers briefly, piercing, unreadable, but strangely calm. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, still and steady as if carved from stone. The priest's voice echoed faintly in the cold air as the vows began. Alina's lips felt dry, and she had to force the words out. I do. Her voice was so soft that for a moment she wasn't sure if anyone had heard. When it was Elias's turn, he spoke with a voice that was low and even, yet carried an unexpected weight. I do. No hesitation, no sign of joy, just acceptance. The ring was simple, silver and cold against her skin. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried all the weight of her choice. After the ceremony, they did not linger. No music, no dancing, no feast. Elias simply turned his wheelchair and left through the side door. The villagers whispered behind her, but Alina kept her head high. She followed him out into the pale afternoon light, where a black carriage waited. The Beau. Ride to his home was long and silent. Snow-covered trees passed by like ghosts, their bare branches reaching out as if to pull her back. She stole glances at Elias, but he looked straight ahead, his face unreadable. The manor came into view at last, a tall stone house with dark windows, surrounded by towering pines. Its walls seemed to hold the chill of the season, and its shadow stretched far over the snow. When they entered, the air inside was warmer but smelled faintly of old wood and something distant, like lavender long faded from the curtains. Elias led her through the main hall. His chair moved quietly over the polished floor, the sound of its wheels almost softer than her footsteps. Portraits hung on the walls, faces of people she did not know, all looking down at her as if judging her worth. A maid showed Alina to her room, a large chamber with tall windows and heavy curtains. The bed was neatly made, its white sheets crisp and perfect. It looked like a room meant for a guest, not a wife. As she placed her small bag on the table, a soft knock came. The maid entered again, this time holding an envelope. "From Mr. Elias," she said, and left without another word. Inside the envelope was a bank draft. The amount made her breath catch. It was more than enough for her mother's surgery. Her hands shook as she held it, her heart swelling with relief and aching at the same time. Somewhere in the house, she heard the sound of Elias's wheelchair moving away. He had given her what she had come for, and in return, she belonged to a life she had not chosen. That night, she lay awake in her new room. The silence of the manor pressed in on her, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock in the hallway. She stared at the ceiling, the faint moonlight casting pale shapes across it. Her mother would live. That was all that mattered. And yet, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage, with the door shut and the key thrown far away. The walls between them. The days in the manor felt like pages from a book that someone had forgotten to finish, long stretches of silence punctuated by small, quiet moments that never seemed to lead anywhere. Alina woke each morning to the same. Pale light spilling through the tall windows, the frost outside drawing delicate white lace across the glass. The manor was vast, with hallways that seemed to stretch into shadow, rooms that smelled faintly of dust and closed-off air, and staircases that creaked softly as though whispering secrets. Elias kept to his own spaces. Most days, she saw him. Only at breakfast and dinner, always at the long dining table that could seat 20 people but held only 2. The clink of cutlery against porcelain was often the loudest sound in the room. He spoke little. Questions about her comfort, polite remarks about the weather, occasional inquiries about whether she needed anything. His words were formal, as, if spoken from behind an invisible wall. She noticed that his eyes rarely stayed on her for long. Sometimes she wondered if he even wanted her here, or if this marriage was nothing more than a transaction to him, a way to quiet rumors or fill some obligation. One afternoon, unable to bear the silence, Alina began to explore the manor. She wandered through the library, where towering shelves overflowed with books whose spines were cracked from years of use. A faint scent of leather and ink hung in the air. She traced her fingers over the titles, pausing at old travel journals and poetry collections. She wondered if they belonged to Elias, if before the accident he had dreamed of faraway places. In the west wing, she discovered a music room. Dust lay thick on the keys of a grand piano, as though no one had touched it in years. She pressed one key gently. The note rang out, soft but clear, and for a moment the manor seemed to breathe again, but then the sound faded, and the silence returned. That evening, she caught a glimpse of Elias in the study. The door was half open, and he sat by the fire, his face lit by the warm glow of the flames. A book lay open on his lap, but his eyes were fixed on the fire as if lost in some faraway memory. His right hand trembled slightly as he turned a page. She noticed this for the first time, a small sign of weakness beneath the composed exterior. She thought of speaking to him then, of stepping inside and breaking the barrier that hung between them. But before she could, he closed the book and wheeled himself deeper into the shadows of the room. That night, as she lay in bed, she wondered about the man she had married. He was not cruel, never unkind in his words or actions, but he carried a heaviness, a sorrow that filled the air between them like invisible smoke. It made her chest ache in ways she didn't understand. She began to watch him more closely, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She noticed how he sometimes paused before speaking, as though weighing each word carefully. How his gaze lingered on the garden outside, even when the snow had buried every flower. How his hands tightened on the wheels of his chair whenever someone mentioned the past. One evening, as the wind howled against the windows, Alina gathered the courage to sit across from him in the study. She placed a small plate of warm bread on the table beside him. "I thought you might like this," she said softly. For a moment he didn't move, Then his eyes lifted to hers. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost gentle in his voice. It wasn't much, just a single word, but it was a crack in the wall between them, and Alina felt it. She left the study that night with a strange flutter in her chest, unsure if it was hope or danger. The first crack in the armor. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was pale and still, the next dark clouds rolled in, heavy with rain. By afternoon, the manor was wrapped in the sound of wind beating against the shutters and rain slashing against the glass. The corridors felt darker than usual, the candle flames bending from the drafts that crept in through hidden cracks. Alina had been in the library most of the day, curled in a chair by the window with a book she could barely focus on. Her thoughts kept wandering to her mother, recovering in the small village clinic, to Elias, who had retreated into his study since morning. Late in the afternoon, the air turned colder. She decided to take some blankets to the upper-floor storage room, a place she rarely visited. The hallway there was narrow, and the light from the single window was dim. As she carried the folded blankets, her foot caught on the edge of a loose rug. She fell hard. The blanket slipped from her arms, and the side of her knee scraped against the wooden floor. Pain flared sharply, making her gasp. She tried to stand, but winced as her leg trembled. Before she could gather herself, she heard the soft whir of wheels against the floor. Elias appeared from the shadows of the hallway, moving his chair with surprising speed. His brows were drawn together, and for the first time since she had met him, there was urgency in his eyes. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. I tripped," she admitted, embarrassed. "It's nothing really," but he was already pulling a folded handkerchief from his coat. He wheeled closer, stopping just in front of her. "Let me see." Alina hesitated. It felt strange, this closeness, his attention focused entirely on her. Slowly, she shifted so he could see the scrape. His fingers brushed against her skin as he cleaned the small wound. They were warm and careful, yet there was a firmness in his touch, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. "You should be more careful in these halls," he murmured. They weren't built for rushing. Alina found herself watching his face as he worked. The firelight from a nearby wall sconce caught the edges of his features. Strong jaw, a faint scar running near his temple, the faint crease between his brows. She realized there was no coldness in his expression now, only concentration, and something gentler hidden beneath it. When he finished, he wrapped the handkerchief neatly around her knee. "There. That should do until the maid brings some proper ointment." "Thank you," she said softly. For a moment, their eyes met. It wasn't long, but it was enough to send a ripple through her chest. There was a warmth there she had never noticed before, a hint of the man he might have been before the accident, before whatever sorrow had built the walls around him. He leaned back slightly as though remembering himself, and wheeled away without another word. But the echo of that moment stayed with her long after the sound of his chair faded down the hall. That night, Alina sat awake in her room, the storm still rattling the windows. She replayed the scene in her mind, not just his kindness, but the way he had moved toward her without hesitation, the way his voice had softened without him realizing. It was only a small crack in the armor he wore, but she could feel it now. Beneath the cold exterior was a man who had once lived differently, a man who perhaps still cared, even if he didn't want to admit it. And for the first time since their wedding, she began to wonder, not just who Elias was, but what secrets he was keeping. Whispers in the dark. The manor was silent that night, but it was not the kind of peaceful silence that made one feel safe. It was the heavy, breathing kind, the kind that carried the creak of wood, the faint rustle of curtains, and the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Alina sat in her bed, her lamp dim, the book on her lap unread. She had tried to lose herself in its pages, but her mind kept drifting to the way Elias had looked at her earlier that day, the way his guarded eyes had softened, if only for a heartbeat. A low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance, and the faint scent of rain drifted through the slightly open window. Unable to sleep, she pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The light was dim, shadows stretching long along the walls. She was passing the study when she noticed the faint glow of firelight spilling from under the door. Something made her stop. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening. Then, she heard it. His voice. Low, slow, and strangely sad. She pushed the door open slightly. Elias sat by the fireplace, not reading, not writing, just staring into the flames. His face was half lit by the flickering fire, the other half swallowed by shadow. In that moment, he looked older than his years, and lonelier than she could bear to see. He turned his head slightly. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice quiet without its usual formality. "No," she admitted. "The rain and the storm." She hesitated, then stepped inside. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." He gestured to the, chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, settling into the chair, the warmth of the fire washing over her chilled skin. For a long moment they sat in silence, the fire cracking softly between them. "It's strange," Elias began, his gaze still on the flames. "How storms at night sound like voices if you listen long enough. My father used to tell me the wind carried the words of people long gone. I never believed him. Until the accident." Alina turned her eyes toward him. "The carriage?" His jaw tightened, but his voice did not falter. "Yes, it was raining that day too. The road was slick. The horses spooked, bolted downhill. I remember the sound of the wheels skidding, the way the sky spun above me, then nothing. I woke up 2 weeks later in this chair." There was no self-pity in his tone, but there was something worse. Acceptance. The kind that came after fighting a battle you could never win. "People treated me differently after that," he continued. "Some out of pity, some out of disgust. The friends who promised to stay vanished. The woman I was to marry disappeared without a word. And this house," he glanced around the room, "became more a prison than a home." Alina's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. She had not expected him to speak so openly. She felt as though he had opened a door inside himself that had been locked for years. "I suppose," he said with a faint, humorless smile. "That's why I agreed to this arrangement. I didn't want love anymore. Love leaves, contracts, stay." The words cut deeper than he probably intended. Alina lowered her eyes, unsure how to answer. But after a moment, she spoke softly. "Not everything that stays is cold, and not everything that leaves is love." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. And for the first time, the distance in his eyes seemed to shrink. "You're different, Alina." She felt her heart beat faster, though she wasn't sure why. "Different how?" But Elias didn't answer. He turned back to the fire, his expression unreadable, and yet she could feel the air between them had changed. When she returned to her room later, the rain was still falling, but it no longer felt so lonely. For the first time since she had stepped into this house, Alina wondered if perhaps, the unimaginable fate awaiting her might not be the one she had feared, but something else entirely. The unimaginable twist begins. The morning after their quiet conversation, the manor seemed different to Alina. The air felt lighter somehow, as though the heavy walls had absorbed some of the words they had shared the night before and were quietly holding them between the two of them. She woke to the soft, pale glow of sunlight pouring through the tall windows. casting golden lines across the floor. Outside, the snow sparkled, fresh from the night storm, the world looking clean and untouched. As she dressed, a thought settled in her mind. Something had shifted with Elias. It wasn't love, not yet. But the silence between them no longer. Felt like a locked door. It felt like a hallway where footsteps were slowly, cautiously meeting in the middle. When she entered the dining hall, she expected to find him already at the table. But his chair was empty. The maid informed her that he had gone to the village at dawn, an unusual choice for a man who rarely left the manor. No reason was given. Hours passed before she heard the sound of wheels against the stone floor. Elias entered the main hall, the winter air still clinging to him. His coat was dusted with snow, his gloves damp, and his eyes different. There was a light in them she hadn't seen before. A quiet intensity. "I went to see your mother," he said simply, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Alina's breath caught. "You... what?" "She's healing well," he continued. "The doctor says she's strong enough to return home soon, but she's still weak. She'll need care, so—" He paused, watching her face carefully. "I've arranged for her to live here, in the manor." The words felt like they hung in the air for a moment, too heavy and too good to fall. Alina's hand went to her chest. "Here?" "Yes. With us." His tone softened, and for a flicker of a second she saw vulnerability in his eyes, as though he feared she might refuse. She could barely speak. "Why would you do that?" Elias looked away toward the tall windows where sunlight spilled over the frozen gardens. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything familiar, and I don't want you to lose her while you're bound to this house because of me." The truth hit her like a wave. He had thought of her, not just as a stranger he had married for convenience, but as someone whose pain he could understand. But before she could thank him, the sound of horses echoed, outside and fast, urgent. Moments later, the front doors opened and a man entered, his boots dripping with snow. His face was pale, his expression grave. He handed Elias a sealed envelope. "It's from the solicitor. It's urgent." Elias took it, breaking the wax. Seal with steady hands. His eyes scanned the page, and something in his face hardened. Alina leaned forward, but he said nothing at first. Finally, he folded the letter and placed it on the table beside him. "It seems," he said slowly, "that my late uncle's will has changed everything. I've inherited something I never wanted, and it will bring trouble here. Trouble that may reach you." Alina frowned. "What do you mean?" He met her gaze, his voice low. "It means, Alina, the world outside these walls will soon be very interested in who I am and in who you are." Her stomach tightened. There was a shadow in his words, a warning that their quiet, careful life was about to be swept into something far bigger than either of them had imagined. And though she did not yet understand the full meaning, she could feel it. The air shifting again, the ground beneath her feet beginning to tilt. Fate was moving, and whatever was coming, it would change everything.